All right, let's go ahead and get started. And let me remind you, I don't think I have to remind many of you, but just in case you have forgotten or haven't heard, we are not having class on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. So basically we have today, and then when you come back from Thanksgiving, we have that Tuesday and that Thursday, and that will be it for the class. Then of course finals are the next week. So you're getting really, really close to successfully completing Finance 330. And hopefully I haven't scared too many of you off, so maybe you will want to take another finance class at some point in the future. All right, now a couple of things. First of all, you have your quiz number 4. We're going to go ahead and get that out of the way before Thanksgiving so you can enjoy your turkey and dressing and whatever else that you're going to eat. So if you take a look, if you go to your Canvas page, take a look, you'll see quiz number 4. It opens today at 2 o'clock, so right after class. It closes Tuesday, November 22nd at 11:59 p.m. So you've got today, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday to take the quiz. It's probably going to take you all of 10 minutes to take, okay? 5 questions. The questions are from Chapter 7, which is stock valuation. So, I mean, it's going to be pretty simple. Now, let me remind you also of the 4 quizzes, your highest 3 quiz grades count. So, if you've taken all 3 and made 100, then technically you don't even have to take this quiz if you don't want to. Although, I would probably take it just because you may see some questions that might pop up again somewhere in the final exam. But again, that's up to you. All right, what else? Any other questions? I want to thank also everybody who was able to attend the financial literacy seminar on Tuesday. I wasn't really crazy about the format of it after we kind of got going. It was a little bit different than what we typically do. But I think it was fun. I think it was pretty successful, and we had about 30 plus people there. Now, I will give credit to this class. About 27 of them were from this class, okay? So thank you for the support, or I'm glad you were desperate for 5 bonus points. One of the two, whichever one, whatever, it worked out. It was good. And in the spring, we'll have some more traditional deals like we normally have, and there'll be some really good prizes that we give away to motivate you to come, other than the fact that you learn all kinds of valuable financial information. But we're giving away a couple of $500 scholarships, so I'm sure any of you could use a $500 scholarship. And there's also some really good toys, iPad minis, and other things. All right, now if you go to, I want to point out one thing. If you go to your Canvas page, and you go down to the testing material, so we're going to go down to the study guide for the final exam and the bonus test. So let me bring that up for just a second. Now what you're going to see is this is, as I said, after even with chapter 6 and chapter 7, well, I kind of cut out parts of chapters, but really starting now when we get to chapter 10, 11, 12, we're actually skipping chapter 9. But you'll notice here, for the final exam, it's going to cover chapter 6, chapter 7, the first 6 slides from chapter 10, and then slides from chapter 11. So that's what we're going to talk about today in class. And then, when you come back from Thanksgiving, we're going to talk about the bonus test material, which are going to be slides 7 through 30 from chapter 10, and then maybe, I think there's just a couple of slides from chapter 12. And I'll explain, and it should become more apparent in just a few minutes while we're breaking it down into slides 1 through 6, and then I'm stopping, and then we're coming back and picking that up. Okay, there's kind of a break there. So I just wanted you to kind of understand what's happening if you look at this and go, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. He's lost his mind with this, you know. Why is he dividing it up? Okay, so quiz. The chapter 10, chapter 11 today, and then we'll come back and finish things up. So let me pull up my chapter 10. All right, so we're going to go through the first 6 slides. Now, what we're doing here is, again, we're switching gears somewhat, because in chapter 6 we talked about bond valuation, in chapter 7 we talked about stock valuation. And in those chapters we can look at it from 2 different perspectives. One is we can look at it in terms of learning more about investments. So if you want to invest in bonds, we talked about that. If you want to invest in stock, we talked about that, either preferred stock or common stock. But also we said that in those 2 chapters, bonds and stock, that's 2 ways that a corporation can raise capital on which it can spend on various projects. So if it wants to build a factory, if it wants to buy new equipment, if it wants to introduce a new product line, whatever, it takes a lot of money to do that. So we've talked about that in chapter 6 and 7. Now in chapter 10, we're jumping ahead to what's called capital budgeting and capital budgeting techniques. So what this is referring to is essentially when a corporation raises money by issuing bonds or issuing stock, how does it decide what to spend the money on? How does it analyze those capital budgeting investments, which are expensive investments? So that's what this is referring to. Okay, so here's some definitions. The first thing, capital budgeting. It says capital budgeting is the process of evaluating and selecting long-term investments that are consistent with the goal of maximizing shareholder wealth. So what this simply means is if a company is going to spend $100 million, $50 million, $300 million, whatever. Actually, I just read this morning, actually, that Under Armour Corporation is planning to spend $400 million on a new company headquarters next year. $400 million. That's a lot of money for a building. Well, that's true. They can sell 5 hoodies and they've got it paid back, okay? I mean, but that's a lot. As a matter of fact, it was comparing it with Nike, and it said that was, and they were talking about capital expenditures. They call it CapEx, and so they were talking about. They said that is half of Nike's CapEx or capital expenditures for a year, but Under Armour is 1/8 the size of Nike. That kind of puts it into perspective. Okay, so they're spending a lot more. So basically, what that says is, they're planning for a lot of big things in the future. And if it works out, it's going to make some investors really, really happy. If it doesn't work out, and it's happened before where people have all these big ideas and they spend a ton of money on something and it simply doesn't work out, for example, the Titanic, then, things like that happen in business, and they're probably, stockholders are going to suffer if that big $400 million headquarters doesn't work out. So that's what we're referring to with capital budgeting. So hopefully Under Armour went through some capital budgeting techniques to determine, is this a good expenditure or not? Because the time to determine that is not 3 years after you spent the $400 million. You don't pull your management team together and go, guess what? We probably shouldn't have spent all this money on this headquarters, because it's too late at that point. A couple of other terms to be familiar with, and that's what you're going to see as we go through the first 6 slides here, just basically some terminology that you need to be aware of for the final exam. A capital expenditure, thus the term capital budgeting. This is when a company spends money on an asset that is expected to produce benefits for more than 1 year. So it's a long-term investment. So again, equipment, buildings, research and development, something like that. That is in contrast to the other term that you see, the last one here, which is a current expenditure or an operating expenditure. And this is expected to produce benefits for less than 1 year. So this is some type of short-term investment. Now, you could make the argument that if a company, let's say what, I don't have anything up here to use as an example. Okay, mechanical pencils. Okay, I see somebody's holding a mechanical pencil. So let's say you've got a big corporation and they decide to spend, they're like, man, we need office supplies. We need paper, we need mechanical pencils, we need paper clips, we need whatever. and we're going to spend $1 million on that. Well, yeah, $1 million is a lot of money, but you don't necessarily expect the paper to last for 10 years. Okay, you don't expect the paper clips to last for 10 years. You're not going to pay some highly paid financial analyst to determine should we buy paper clips or should we not buy paper clips. Okay, on the other hand, if you're going to spend $100 million on a new warehouse for your corporation, you probably would like to know beforehand if that's a good investment or not. And again, as you'll notice, as we go through some of this, a lot of this is science, but a lot of it is just really being able to guess correctly. Because if you're trying to plan something 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future, a lot of it is just a guess at best. I mean, it really is, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow a lot of times in the business world, much less a year from now or 5 or 10 years from now. So as we take a look at the terms, again, be familiar with these. You will see these terms again, okay? This is the capital budgeting process. You really don't have to go through, you don't have to write all this down, but I just want to discuss it really quickly. This is what a corporation does when it decides it's going to spend some money. So, and a lot of it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. For example, proposal generation. What do we want to invest in? What do we want to spend our money on? Review and analysis. Decision making. Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about when we talk about capital budgeting techniques and how do we measure and determine if an investment is good. And then implementing the decision. And then finally, follow-up. And this is what a lot of corporations forget to do. They go through all of this. They go through 1 through 4. And then they forget to go back and take a look and see how accurate was our forecast in terms of should we invest in this or should we not invest in it. Sometimes that's just an oversight. Sometimes you really don't want to know how bad your capital budgeting technique was. You know, how bad did we screw up? I will guarantee the makers of the Titanic did not go back and take a look at their capital budgeting process to determine where did we mess up, okay? So those are the capital budgeting process. Now, some more terms, independent versus mutually exclusive projects. This has to do with what a company can invest in, so you need to know the difference between these two. The first one listed here, and I'll give you an example of these in just a minute, independent projects. Independent projects are projects whose cash flows are unrelated or independent of each other, which means if you accept one of the projects, it doesn't eliminate the other project. So basically what this means is you can accept as many projects as meet your minimum criteria. And again, I'll come back to that in just a minute, but this plays an important role in when we're going through the capital budgeting process. We need to know, are the projects independent or are they mutually exclusive, because it makes a big difference into, you know, as to what we accept. The second type of projects listed here, mutually exclusive. These are projects that compete with each other. What that means is they essentially do the same thing, and you're going to choose just one project. So if you're looking at 3 different projects and all of them meet your minimum criteria, you still have to choose just one project. So independent versus mutually exclusive. Now, let me give you an example of these. And I'm actually going to start with the second one first, mutually exclusive. Let's say that you have a warehouse, a big, huge warehouse. And you're trying to figure out how to get items from one end of the warehouse to the other end. So from receiving to shipping. And you're looking at a couple of different options. One option is a conveyor belt system that runs from one end of the warehouse to the other. So it's going to move your boxes or your whatever you're moving from one end to the other. The other option is you could buy a fleet of forklifts. And the forklifts could take your stuff from one end of the warehouse to the other end. The conveyor belt and the forklifts do the same thing. So this is an example of mutually exclusive projects. If you invest in one, you don't need the other. So you're going to choose, if both of them meet your minimum criteria, you're just going to choose one. On the other hand, independent projects might be if you're analyzing the purchase of a conveyor belt system for your warehouse, and you're also looking at purchasing some really expensive accounting software for your front office. Okay, the conveyor belt system and the accounting software, those are two completely different things. They have nothing to do with each other. So those are the examples of independent projects. You would analyze them independently. They do different things. You could accept both of them if they meet your minimum criteria. You can accept just one of them if one of them meets your minimum criteria, or you could turn down both of them, depending on what's happening. Does that make sense, or the difference between mutually exclusive versus independent? And again, this is going to come into play later, other than just the definition, so we need to understand the difference in those. All right, a couple of other definitions here. Unlimited funds versus capital rationing. And this is basically just textbook versus real world. In textbooks, typically, or a lot of times, we assume that we have unlimited funds to invest. So a corporation, if it has fantastic investment opportunities, if it has 100 of them, that it can finance all 100 investment opportunities. Well, for textbooks, that's okay. But in real life, that's not very practical, because corporations, believe it or not, are just like us in terms of they can only spend so much money. So they have a budget, they have a capital expenditure budget, and they have to try to find the best investments that will fit within that capital expenditure budget. So they have to practice what's called capital rationing, which means simply they have to find the best investments based on the amount of money they have to spend. And you've got different projects competing for these investment dollars. So whether it's a small company and they've got $1 million to spend, or whether it's a Under Armour and they've got $400 million to spend, I mean, they're going to find the best projects possible. So again, unlimited funds versus capital rationing. And then finally, I think this is the 6th slide for chapter 10, accept, reject versus ranking approaches. This is just a couple of different ways that you can approach capital budgeting projects. The first one, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. The accept, reject approach simply means if a project meets your minimum criteria, you undertake it, you accept it. And if it doesn't, you reject it. I mean, just straightforward. The other is a ranking approach of, we've got X number of dollars for capital expenditures. We're going to rank these projects from the best to the worst, and we're just going to start out with, this has the highest internal rate of return, it's going to cost this much money, and we just go down the list basically until we run out of money. And the next year we start over and we do it again. So that's basically, and again, some companies use one of these or the other, some use a combination of the two. Okay, so that should be, okay, so when we come back from, now we're going to jump ahead to chapter 11, but this is what we're going to come back to when we finally come back from Thanksgiving and jump back into the different techniques, because here we're going to go through how do you determine what's a good project or what's a bad project. So you're going to need your financial calculator for this actually, so we will be getting back into that. So that is the first 6 slides from chapter 10. Now let me jump over to chapter 11. And you'll notice there are not many slides in chapter 11. There are 8 total. Okay, so, and again, I'm not really sure why they divided it up the way they did, but that's why we're jumping around somewhat. In chapter 11, we talk about the cash flows associated with capital budgeting projects. And that's one of the really important parts, is determining what are outflows and what are inflows from these potential investments, because we're going to use that when we go back into chapter 10 to use the capital budgeting techniques. We're going to use the cash inflows and outflows. So it says here, to evaluate investment opportunities, financial managers must determine the relevant cash flows. And that may sound pretty simple, but it's actually a little more technical than it looks, because you have to determine what's going to go into this decision, what's not going to enter into our decision. So the relevant cash flows are what's called the incremental cash outflows and the resulting cash inflows associated with a capital budgeting project. So again, we have to know which are the relevant cash flows, which ones are not relevant. And these incremental cash flows, the ones that we're interested in, these are the additional cash flows, and they could either be outflows, which are negative cash flows to our company, or inflows, which are positive cash flows, expected to result from a proposed capital expenditure. So as we're analyzing an investment, as we'll see on one of the slides that comes after this, we have to determine, first of all, is this a replacement project? Are we replacing an old piece of equipment, for example, with a new, faster, more efficient piece of equipment? Or is it an expansion project, which means we are adding on to what we already have? It makes a big difference, because if it's a replacement project, we're just looking at the difference between what the new piece of equipment can do and what the old piece of equipment can do. Not the total, just the difference. If it's a replacement project, if it's an expansion project, then we're looking at the total cash flow. So here are the cash flows that can be associated with a capital budgeting project. All of these, especially number 3, sometimes that doesn't occur, but let me talk about each one of these. Okay, so the 3 basic cash flow components. The first is the initial investment. This is pretty simple. It's what you're spending on the asset that you're investing in. So if you're building a warehouse, then that is, what is it costing you to build the warehouse? This is going to occur at time period 0, so we assume it's today, and this is going to be a negative cash flow. That's what this is representing. Okay? So this is cash that's flowing out of our corporation. Now you'll notice that once we get into the calculation of how do you determine if this is a good investment or not, you'll notice we've already done this. Remember back in chapter 5 when we used the cash flow register and we were calculating the present value of a mixed stream of cash flows? Now what happened was, when we hit our CF key, we had the cash flow at time period 0 was the first one to come up, and we always went past it to cash flow number 1 because we didn't have a cash flow at time period 0. Well, here we will, and that's going to be the initial investment. So it's going to be a negative cash flow. It's what we're spending. And then once we've spent the money, we need to calculate the operating cash, hopefully inflows. They're not always inflows. And this is the incremental after-tax cash flows resulting from a project during its life. So these, we hope, are positive, but occasionally they might be negative. And an example of this might be, let's say you buy a piece of machinery factory, a really expensive, really technical piece of machinery that's supposed to be faster, more energy efficient, and it can produce a lot more items. Well, you've done some research, and you know if you buy this piece of machinery, you spend all this money on it, for the first 3 years of its life, it's going to produce just a lot of stuff for you. It's going to do a fantastic job. But historically, after the 3rd year of running it 24 hours a day, you have to take that piece of machinery offline. You have to tear it down. You have to overhaul almost the entire piece of machinery. It's going to take several months to do this. So you're not going to get much production out of that piece of machinery during year 4. As a matter of fact, it's going to cost you a lot of money to tear it down and refurbish it. And so you might actually, for the first 3 years, you might have positive cash flows, but then in the 4th year, you may actually have a negative cash flow. But then once you've got it back up and running, years 5, 6, and 7, you expect it to produce positive cash flows again. So that's just one simple example of how that could be positive or negative. And then finally, with some projects, you have what's called a terminal cash flow. It says this is the after-tax non-operating cash flow occurring in the final year of a project, and it is usually attributable to the liquidation of the project. This is pretty straightforward. If, let's say you're buying a bulldozer. A bulldozer is your capital budgeting project. And you plan on running that bulldozer for 5 years. At the end of the 5th year, you think that bulldozer is still going to be worth $50,000. You think you can sell it. You're estimating, and again, you notice we're forecasting 5 years into the future. What's this bulldozer going to be worth? You think it's going to be worth 50 grand. So when you sell it, that's going to be a terminal positive cash flow to you of $50,000. You sell it, that cash flow flows in. On the other hand, some projects may have a negative terminal cash flow. For example, let's say you're an oil company. You've got an oil drilling operation somewhere in Alaska, and you've been pumping oil out of the ground for 10 years. But eventually that oil well is going to run dry. And what happens with oil drilling, even though it's necessary, it's kind of messy. And it really messes up everything around it. So you just don't pack up your oil drilling equipment and drive off. Okay? You have to refurbish the land around you. And it's going to cost millions of dollars to make that place look good again from the viewpoint of somebody walking by, and environmentally, making it environmentally friendly again. So if you're an oil drilling operation and you're going through the capital budgeting process of an oil exploration, well, you've got to determine what's it going to cost us to find oil and to start drilling. What's it going to cost, what's it going to bring in for us once we find oil? And then at the end of the life of the project, what's it going to cost us to clean up so that we can leave? So again, lots of estimation, really, really difficult estimation. And also keep in mind, not all projects have terminal cash flows. Sometimes you buy an asset, at the end of its life, when you're done, it's just worth nothing. So you either throw it away, or you may have to actually pay somebody to haul it off for you. I mean, that's just, pretty straightforward, pretty simple. But again, these are the 3 cash flows. This is what the cash flows would look like on a timeline. So notice here, this is just an example where we're spending $50,000 on an asset, whatever it is. This is a negative cash flow. Then once we buy this project, this asset, it's going to provide these cash inflows for us. They're positive over the next 10 years. So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 8, 10, whatever. And then finally, at the end of the life of the project, we're assuming we can sell it and receive $25,000. This is another positive cash flow. So this would be added to the $10,000. So the 10th year, we would have a positive $35,000 total cash flow. So again, initial investment, operating cash flows, and then this project actually does have a terminal cash flow. So is everybody following me so far, kind of in what it doesn't really make a lot of sense until we actually get into the numbers of putting this into the calculator, but are you kind of following me so far in terms of what we're working our way towards? And again, this is just a lot of, really not many calculations, it's just terms, it's definitions. So you should be able to do really well on this part of the final exam. Okay, and this is what I was referring to earlier, where if you have capital budgeting projects, they're either going to be replacement or expansion. A replacement project, as I said, you're replacing one asset with another asset. So if you're a farmer and you run, let's say, 4 tractors, and your 4 tractors, they're getting older, they use a lot of fuel, maybe they have tires on them, and you're looking at maybe going to a track system because of it'll do less damage to your fields. But tractors are expensive. I mean, big tractors cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if you're replacing 4 of them, you're looking in excess of $1 million expenditure. So you want to know, if you buy these 4 new tractors to replace the 4 old tractors, you want to know, okay, how much am I going to save in diesel fuel? How much am I going to save in maintenance costs? How much faster are they? How much more efficient are they? How much more, do they have the computer systems where I'm not going to miss parts of the ground when I'm putting in my crops, that type of thing. So you're looking at the difference between what the new equipment will do and what the old equipment will do. That's your only thing you're analyzing. Okay, you're not looking at the total that these replacement tractors would be. Now, if you're expanding, if you've got 4 tractors and you're thinking about buying a 5th one, well, that's an expansion project. So that's easy, because then you just have to determine what is the new tractor going to do for me in terms of operating inflows versus operating outflows. Is it worth it? And most of the time when you're doing that, you don't make those decisions lightly, or you shouldn't. You shouldn't just wake up one morning if you're a farmer and go, I think I'm going to go spend $300,000 on a new tractor simply because I want to. That's probably not the best way to run your farming operation. Okay, so replacement versus expansion. And these are the relevant cash flows for the different types. So these are replacement decisions. And again, you don't have to worry about this, but again, we've got the initial investment, the operating cash inflows, and the terminal cash flow. And then also a couple of other terms you need to be familiar with. You will see these definitions on the final exam. That is the difference between what's called a sunk cost and an opportunity cost. And the reason these are important is because one of these is to be factored into your decision, the other is not factored in. So the first one listed here, sunk cost. These are cash outlays that have already been made, and therefore underlined, so you need to know this, they have no effect on your capital budgeting decision. Okay, so it says here underneath here, sunk costs should not be included in a project's incremental cash flows. So no sunk costs are not included in your calculations. The other type, opportunity costs. These are cash flows that could be realized from the best alternative use of an asset. These do affect your decision. They do enter into your capital budgeting decision. It says opportunity costs should be included as an outflow when one is determining a project's incremental cash flows. So, for example, let's say that you own a piece of property outside of Murray on 641 North. You've got just a piece of land there. It's great highway frontage. And you're looking at a couple of different alternatives for that land. One is you could build your own strip mall and either run your own business from there, or you could lease that strip mall out, lease parts of it out to other businesses. But before you do that, you're going to have the land surveyed. You're going to have some dirt work done. You're going to have utilities there. I mean, you have to spend some money initially before you build your strip mall. The other opportunity is you could simply lease the entire piece of land to somebody else, and they could then, if they wanted to, build a business or put in a strip mall or whatever they wanted to do. But you still have to have the surveys done. You still have to have some initial dirt work done, and you still have to have some utilities in place. Now, the survey, the dirt work, and the utilities, you're going to do that no matter which option you choose. So those are examples of sunk costs. You're going to do it for both projects no matter what, so they're not going to affect your decision. But the opportunity cost is, if I give up one of the options, what am I going to get from the other option? What's the difference? And so you have to include the difference or the opportunity cost of what you gave up as a cost in this decision. Does that make sense, that last part? Primarily, I can simplify it. Know that sunk costs don't enter into your decision. Opportunity costs do enter into your capital budgeting decision. And let's see. And this is just another example of sunk cost versus opportunity cost. We've got a company here that's looking at a drill press purchased 3 years earlier for $237,000. They're going to renew it. They're going to retrofit it with a computerized control system from an obsolete piece of equipment. The obsolete piece of equipment could be sold today for a high bid of $42,000, but without its computerized control system, it's basically worth nothing. So in this case, the $237,000 cost of the drill press is a sunk cost because it represents an earlier cash outlay. You've already spent the money, okay? So it doesn't affect your decision. And it says, although the company owns the obsolete piece of equipment, the proposed use of its computerized control system represents an opportunity cost of $42,000, the highest price at which it could be sold today. So basically, this is saying that if we do undertake this, we're giving up the $42,000 we could have sold this piece of equipment for. So this is part of the cash flow here. The opportunity cost, it should be included as part of the overall cost of that piece of equipment. Okay? If we didn't include it, if we just included the cost of the equipment, we actually wouldn't be calculating correctly what is it going to cost us, at least initially. All right. Capital budgeting. It gets better, I promise, but we have to go through all of these initial terms because there's a lot of terms associated with capital budgeting that you don't see in other parts of finance. So I am going to give you some time. You can go prepare for your quiz. You can get your quiz number 4 out of the way. It doesn't open up until 2, but I can actually change it to open up a little bit earlier so that you can go ahead and get started. That's all we're covering today. Enjoy your Thanksgiving break. Be careful, be safe, re-energize, relax, come back for the final push for last week of class and final exams. Any other questions? The final exam in this class, I want to say it's on Tuesday at either 1 or 1:30. 1:30. So the Tuesday of final exam week at 1:30. And it'll be in here. I don't know what day that is. The 7th? The 6th? Okay, yeah. It's one day during final exam weeks at 1:30.